Hey there, sports history fan. This is Ross Bliley, the host of the Pigskin Tales podcast. Are you looking for that perfect, unique gift for your sports-loving child or grandchild? Or, as you'll find out, it's great for parents and grandparents as well. I'll tell you what, you're in luck, because this episode is brought to you by Racket, the ultimate device for the ultimate fan. It's perfect for any time you need to make some noise. Racket combines a compact 7-inch megaphone, 8 powerful adjustable LED lights, noisemakers, an insert you design, and it's all fully customizable to match your team's colors. The coolest thing about this product is the founder. J.J. Abraham was the ultimate cheer dad, following his daughter's cheer group around the country. He saw parents using all sorts of crazy contraptions to make noise for their kids. And he had an aha moment. He thought, why not combine all of these thingamajiggers into an all-in-one compact device for the ultimate fan? So JJ and his team worked 3 tireless years on developing version after version, finally landing on a Racket. That's R-A-K-I-T. So you can make some noise to be part of the action. Get out there and let's get loud. Bring a Racket to your next game or competition to cheer on your favorite team or athlete. You can customize your Racket with your own logos, drawings, and names. Get beads to match your team's colors. Flashing lights add to the excitement. Are you ready to make a Racket? Be part of the game? Each Racket pack comes with 1 Racket megaphone, 1 lanyard to keep a hold of this thing, 2 scratch-resistant bead packs, 1 clear and 1 color of your choice, and a 10-pack of customizable self-adhesive inserts. Currently on sale for $24.99. To pick up your Racket today, head on over to myracket.com. That's myrakeit.com. Now get out there and make some noise! Soundtrack provided by Edikey from filmmusic.io.
Hi, everybody. This is Dan and Andrew, and we'd like to thank you for listening to our latest episode of Hello Old Sports. This is another one of our random team episodes. You may remember that about a half a year ago, or sometime earlier this year, we did the 1981-82 Utah Jazz, and we had so much fun there that we thought we'd give it another shot. So, Andrew, are you ready to see who we're going to be doing next?
It will be funny if it's the same team again, but
we will not do that.
It's interesting because I know we're going to put this on the top of the episode that we're going to record on this team. And as we're speaking at this moment, not only do I not know anything about this team, I don't even know what team it's going to be. And then by the time this 2-hour block or whatever is over, I will be an expert or at least passable on whatever this team is. So,
and also all of you listeners, since you clicked on this episode, whenever that is, December, January, whenever we get it posted, you know exactly who we're going to talk about. And we here on November the 9th have no idea. So
I can't remember the order we did this in last year. Did we do the sport first or the year first?
We did the sport first. Oh, but yeah, because we don't know. I mean, we want to base the year on the sport, because if it's baseball, we'd be fine going back to the 20s or wherever. But for basketball, obviously, unless we want to do the Red Man Tobaccos, we wouldn't be able to go back that far. So I think what we did last time is we went baseball, basketball, football, sort of alphabetical 1, 2, 3.
So I have our random number generator up. This one, first one will be 1 through 3. MLB is 1, NBA is 2, NFL is 3, right? All right.
That's fine. Yeah, that's fine.
Generate, and the number is 3. So we will be doing an NFL team. What do we want to make the year parameters here? So we're talking NFL now.
Let's go 1950. Because I feel like that was when the AAFC and the NFL merged. We did an episode on that earlier this year. And I feel like that's kind of like where the modern NFL kind of sort of began. So let's go with that.
What would the later bracket be? 2000, 2010, What?
Let's just go 2021.
2021.
Yeah,
Okay.
just do the duration.
If we get a 2020 and it's a bad team, I'm just going to talk about COVID football the whole thing. All right. 1950, 2021. We are hitting the button now. 2007.
Imagine
it would be in the 2007 Giants or Patriots. That's going to be great. All right.
So a little preview for you folks, and who knows, depending on our editing, this episode might actually air after that one. But we talked about we're going to do at the holidays when we're together. We're going to do our first ever live watch along of Super Bowl 42. 15 years ago between the Giants and the Patriots, which was the 2007 season. So we're going to be really talking a lot of 2007 NFL. So what are you?
Let me pull up the NFL standings for that year. I just want to, what we did last time is I did it by conference, and then 1 through 16 was, the AFC, and 1 through, or we did like East West for the NBA.
Yeah. Tell me what website you're using so I can look at it too.
Okay, so I pulled up Pro Football Reference. I'm going to see if I can get this sorted by conference. I guess it really doesn't matter. I'll just go by division. Right?
Yeah, so we're going by division from the first place team in the AFC East, which was the Patriots, all the way down to the fourth place team in the NFC West, which was the St. Louis Rams. So
when we do the number, it's not going to be the record or anything. It's just going to be where they are in this list. It would be funny if it's the 07 Cowboys, because I could ask my friend Mike if he would want to do it with me, but he will absolutely think I'm just trolling him. All right. So 32 teams in the NFL in 2000, 1 through 32 all loaded in. Are you ready?
Yeah, I'm ready. We got, you got a Peyton Manning Colts team. You got Roethlisberger with the Steelers. Favre's last year with the Packers. Pittsburgh Steelers were Cleveland Browns 10-6 that year. I can't even say I remember that. So you've got a lot of Redskins. The Redskins were not in the playoffs that year. Yes, they were. Redskins a playoff team that year. They were a wild card. So you got a lot of stuff, a lot of interesting potentials here. So why don't you go ahead?
So if it's 18, that would be the Giants, just based on what I know. So
and one would be the Patriots.
30. So that would be whoever came in second in the NFC West. We are going to do an episode on the 2007 Arizona Cardinals, who went 8-8 under Ken Whisenunt. But you know what? This will be an interesting thing, because the next year they go to the Super Bowl.
Yep, and this was Leinart a rookie that year? Let's not talk about it too much. But the quarterbacks were Warner and Leinart, and Edgerrin James was on that team. So Fitzgerald, I believe, was probably with them. But by that point, yep, Fitzgerald was there. He might have been a rookie that year. Fitzgerald, he was 24, so he probably wasn't. No, this is like his fourth year in the league. So interesting. It's not really. This is not a deep dive into history. It might have been a little more fun to do it. The 1977 Cardinals, because we'd learn some things, but this will be, the whole, this is,
we'll get an hour out of it. That's the point of these. If we start gimmicking it too much, then it kind of loses the point. You know what I mean? Like, oh, wow, no, let's go later than that or something like that. So we stick with the 07 Cardinals.
Yeah. And this is George Carlin used to have a line when you'd go to see his comedy shows. He'd say, people, I'm here for me. You're here for me. Nobody cares what you think. And so that is not necessarily the case for our, small community of podcast listeners. But I will admit that this is definitely one that's kind of just as much about Andrew and I having a little bit of a challenge and a little bit of a fun. And then as opposed to thinking that there's an episode that everybody's just going to love. So that's what we're doing.
Interestingly enough, George Carlin was actually the assistant GM of the 07 Cardinals.
He was still alive. He didn't die the following year. So,
all right. Well, we are going to cut this clip off in a second. And when we come back, we will magically know a lot more about the 2007 Arizona Cardinals than we do at the moment.
Exactly. All right. Well, stay tuned. Just keep that player playing, and we will. You'll hear a lot about the 2007 Arizona Cardinals. Talk to you guys soon. All right. And hello, old sports, and welcome to the Hello Old Sports podcast. You heard us just few seconds ago, drawing the name at random of the 2007 Arizona Cardinals. And Andrew and I have done some research, and we are ready to tell you everything that you might need or want to know about the '07 Cardinals. Andrew, how you doing?
I am good. I believe I talked a few minutes ago, which was really a few weeks ago, about how magically we would cut this and 10 seconds later know a lot more about the team we were covering. And I do. I don't know how. We certainly don't. You said we'll tell you everything you need to know. Nobody needs to know any of this. If you've gotten this far in the last 15 years without needing to know any of this, I'm going to guess it's not going to become more important as time goes on. We'll do sort of, if you haven't seen or listened to the first episode we did like this on the 81-82 Jazz, we will use this season as a jumping off point for discussions around the time, the team, the characters. We're not going to go game by game and analyze, and then in the third quarter of this game, they, went 3 and out 4 times in a row. But, it's these are sort of different kind of episodes. And once every quarter or so, I feel like it's a good exercise for us. So
before we start, I just want to make one little announcement, which is that very soon we are going to begin recording our 2022 in memoriam episodes, where we commemorate the lives and the legacy of various sports figures, luminaries who passed away in the previous year. Anybody, whether it's Bill Russell or Len Dawson or Maury Wills or anybody else, Clark Gillies of the old Islanders. So if there's anybody out there that you in the listening audience find particularly meaningful, feel free to drop us a line, hellooldsports@gmail.com, or shoot us a message on our Facebook page, and we will have you on, talk about anybody who you thought was particularly important to you in the passed away in 2022 in the world of sports. And we've got a number of, I think about almost a half dozen of our colleagues from the Sports History Network planning to come on with us to talk about various individuals. So check those episodes out when they post. And if you're interested in being a part of it, you know how to reach us. Before then, it is time to get into the 2007 Cardinals. And I think one of the issues that I had with this, and it's a heck of a way to start something, but one of the things that really kind of jumped out is that the league is not that much different than it was, than it is now. And so when we did the 82 Jazz, that's 40 years ago now. So we were kind of able to look at it and be like,
that was like 2 months ago. Sorry, go ahead.
It was 40 years ago. And so like a lot of it was like talking about like what the league was like and how the structure was different, maybe how the playoff structure was a little different. And, obviously with, with the NFL, we could have gone all the way back to 1950, I think was where we drew the line. So if we'd gotten a team in the 50s, 60s, even the 70s, we could have explained a lot more with sort of the flavor of the league. But the NFL now is basically pretty similar to the NFL in 2007. 32 teams, 8 divisions, 4 per conference. There's 1 extra playoff team, but, pretty much every part of the NFL, I guess maybe the TV broadcasts are a little more advanced, but they still had replay then. There's very little different. There's a few guys, at least one in Tom Brady, who was in the league then, who's still playing now. It's not long ago enough to sort of be different,
Yeah, the Rams, Chargers, and Raiders have all moved, but they're still in the same division. They're still the same team. The Chargers, moved just a couple hours away. The Raiders have moved so often it really doesn't matter. And the Rams went back to LA. So yeah, the league is the same structurally. I think Roger Goodell was maybe in his second year as commissioner, first or second year as commissioner. He was a new commissioner. Not that any of that comes up in this. There's no real controversy surrounding the Arizona Cardinals in this year. So yeah, it's funny because it's like, it's weird for me to say this is not a year I have a lot to say about, because I have tons and tons to say about the 2007. My favorite team of all time as a fan, and my favorite moments happened in this year. And as I was looking to try to shoehorn some of that into this, the thing that's interesting, and we touched on this very briefly when we talked today, as I was looking at who the Cardinals played in the NFC West, the teams they played in the division, and then the rest of the teams they played, and I was thinking to myself, okay, if you were going to tell the story of the 2007 NFL season, who are the most essential teams you would need to discuss? So obviously the Giants win the Super Bowl. The Patriots go 16-0. You have a really, really good Cowboys team that goes 13-3. It's Tony Romo's first full year as a starter. The whole Jessica Simpson thing with him. The Packers, as Brett Favre's last year as a Packer, they get to the NFC Championship game. Even the Chargers get to the AFC Championship game. If you go to the other side of the coin, even the Dolphins went 1-15. They played none of these teams. They did not interact with any of. They played 4 playoff teams, which, when you think about it, you have to play at least 3 playoff teams. Yeah, because you're going to play at least 3 division winners, because you play every team in 3 different divisions.
That's a good point. You're
going to play at least three playoff winners. They played 4. None of them, 3 of them lost in the wild card round. 1 lost in the second round. So really, you could absolutely tell the story of the 2007 NFL season without mentioning the Arizona Cardinals, but we're not going to.
No, we're going to tell the story of the 2007 Arizona Cardinals without telling the story of the rest of the NFL, which is a harder task. I found they had the easiest schedule, according to Pro Football Reference, the easiest schedule since the 1965 Philadelphia Eagles. They had the easiest strength of schedule in 42 years. So when you talk about all these great teams they didn't play, now you understand what was going on there.
They never played a team that had that finished any better than 10-6 in any of their 16 games. So just to sort of get the demographic information out of the way, the Cardinals go 8-8 this year. So, right definition of mediocrity, but to be honest, is probably one of the better better Arizona Cardinals seasons in quite a while at 8-8. It's Ken Whisenunt's first year. The year before had been the Denny Green's last year with the Cardinals. And we're going to talk about some of the history of sort of the St. Louis. I don't know how much we're going to need to go back to Chicago, but the St. Louis, Phoenix, Arizona Cardinals, we're going to talk about some of that. The year before that had been the end of the Dennis Green era. They went 5-11. One of the most famous moments of really the last 25 years in the NFL, where the Bears the Bears, who went on to go to the Super Bowl that year, were playing the Cardinals on a Monday night game, and the Cardinals blew a big lead, and that's the famous "the Bears are who we thought they were" line, and he was smacking the podium, and really
we let him off the hook.
His tenure was over at that point. It was just you kind of have to fire a guy after that.
They lost that game, and I remember watching this game. It was a Monday night game. The Cardinals late in the third quarter had a 23-3 lead. And then the Bears, all in the course of, with 2 seconds left, the Bears get a 3-yard defensive fumble return for a touchdown. And then with 5 minutes left in the fourth quarter, they get a 40-yard defensive fumble return. And then Devin Hester returns a punt for 83 yards with 2:58 left to make the final score, or with the extra point to make the final score 24-23. And the Bears, who, hard to believe with what was going on with the Bears for the last 30 or so years, but the Bears were the best team in the NFL at that point in the 2006 season. Like I said, I remember watching this game, and then Dennis Green goes and gives this press conference where he sort of yells incoherently. And if you think about it, you kind of understand what he's saying, but something is not firing with his ability to be articulate. And he's saying, they are who we thought they are. If you want to crown them, then crown their ass. But we let them off the hook. And
then he just kind of walks away.
Then he just kind of left, and I was like, oh, I guess there's no more explanation needed. And that's what's funny too, is that had we done 06 or 08, we'd have a lot more there, but this is 07. So yeah, Green gets fired at the end of the year, and they bring in Ken Whisenunt, who, where had he been? Pittsburgh, I think, was where he had been an assistant coach.
Pittsburgh. He was a Pittsburgh guy. Yeah. I don't know what his specific role it was. I'm going to pull that up right now, but he had been one of the top assistants under, I guess, under Cowher, which would have made sense because '07 would have been Tomlin's first year with the Steelers. So it would make sense that he probably, after not getting that job, would have left for, he'd actually only he'd been in Pittsburgh 6 years. The last 3 as the offensive coordinator under Bill Cowher, and then he leaves and goes to Arizona to become the head coach. And he's actually there from '07 to 12. So by far their longest tenured coach up to that point in quite a while.
So they're 8-8. Whisenhunt is the head coach. The offensive coordinator is Todd Haley, who would later be a head coach in the NFL in his own right. The defensive coordinator is a guy I've never heard of, a guy by the name of Clancy Pendergast, who sounds like an 1880s railroad baron, but was the Cardinals defensive coordinator.
Did you see 2 of the guys on their staff, on their offensive staff?
I know one of them was Maurice Carthon. Who was the other?
Jeff Rutledge,
the Phil Simms backup in the 1986 in Super Bowl 21 in 1986. So yeah, I don't know, who knows. Maybe there's some sort of weird Giants tie there somewhere down the coaching tree. So yeah, I mean, I think the other thing I would mention, and I found this in an article from a website known as raisingzona.com. So raising and then, Zona as in Arizona.com. The owner is Bill Bidwell, and this is the first year that he gives control of his team over to his son, Michael Bidwell. And Michael, I believe, is he still the principal owner today? I think he might be.
I believe the Bidwell family is still the owners, and I was going to talk a little about them, but
I think he's still the principal owner. And this article I read talked about how that was kind of a turning point for the franchise because Michael Bidwell's tenure as owner, he's the principal owner and chairman of the Arizona Cardinals. He took over in 2007. And this has kind of been the best era for the Cardinals, in 75 years. And maybe you'll talk a little bit about that in the beginning, but everybody kind of looks at that turning of the reins from the father over to the son as the turning point for the franchise. And they go on, make the Super Bowl a year later, only Super Bowl in franchise history. They start to, make playoff appearances on some sort of a consistent basis, and kind of a little bit with the new coach, with the new guy in the lead in ownership, taking the lead. You sort of see the seeds of change in what had been a very moribund franchise just start to be sown just a little bit. So did you want to maybe get into a little bit of kind of the history of this team a little bit?
Yeah, and I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time back in Chicago in the 20s, but we'll touch on a couple of things. And the reason, when I was really up until 2007, this was the last year of this. The last 15 years, the Cardinals have been probably a below average franchise, but still that's a lot better than what they were. When I was growing up and people talked about terrible franchises and more specifically terrible owners, the guys they would talk about Donald Sterling, the former Clippers owner. They would talk about the Brown family, the Cincinnati Bengals owners, because of how cheap they were. They would talk about the Bidwells. And then I remember hearing a lot about Marge Schott just because of controversial figure she was. But that was always, the Cardinals owners out there, it's a joke of a franchise, whatever. The Bidwells had actually, Bill Bidwell, and it gets really confusing with different adoptions and divorces and ex-wives and things like that. But we'll start basically, Charles Bidwell took over as the owner of the Chicago Cardinals in 1933. He'd been a minority owner of the Bears. He wanted to buy out George Halas, was not able to do so, took over the Chicago Cardinals and was the owner of the Cardinals until I believe his death in 1947, when Bill Bidwell took over the team. They ultimately moved from Chicago to St. Louis. Really not very successful. I think they had a couple of playoff appearances in the 70s, maybe like 74 and 75. and then they might have made the playoffs in that weird 82 season, that strike season.
They did, in fact, make it in 82, which we talked about in another episode recently on 1982 in sports. They were 5-4, and they lost the wild card game to Green Bay 41-16. So not close.
No, and not to a Green Bay team that I think was 5-4 as well. Not really any better. So where we'll sort of pick up 1987, the Cardinals, who are, they're in St. Louis. They've only been there 15, 17 years. They're a very distant second to the Cardinals, the other Cardinals in that city. They leave, and I have a UPI article from January 15th of 1988 by Lisa Harris. So St. Louis Cardinals owner Bill Bidwell, lured by a lucrative package of $17 million annually and the promise of a new stadium, announced Friday that he will move his NFL team to Phoenix, ending a bidding war among 4 cities. Would you like to guess what some of those other cities were? St. Louis was one of them. I'll say St. Louis was one of them.
So St. Louis was one.
St. Louis, staying in St. Louis, going to Arizona, and there were 2 other cities.
This is late 80s, right? Like 88, you said?
Yeah, 87, 88, yeah.
I
guess more 87 because they announced in January of 88.
I'm guessing one of them was Carolina, Charlotte.
You're very close, not necessarily geographically, but that should be a hint.
Jacksonville.
The other one's not Carolina. Jacksonville would get a team in the next round of expansion started play in, I believe, 94 or 95, but it was announced in the early 90s. No, it was a city that didn't have a team and does now.
City that didn't have a team and does now?
Didn't have a team in 1988 and has a team now.
Vegas?
Baltimore.
Oh, yeah, well, that makes sense. Yeah. Baltimore was kind of the Tampa of the NFL. It would have been
funny if they ended up with another St. Louis team.
That's right. St. Louis Browns. That's a good point. I think
used to be the Browns, but
yeah, no, that's exactly right. That's right. They've gotten 2 Browns have moved to Baltimore. I'm sure that point has been raised by others, but I don't know if it ever occurred to me. So interesting.
Yes. So anyway, so long story short, they move, said the league requires 21 to 28, blah, blah, blah. That same year, by the way, the Raiders had, when it talked about it, they were the last team to move since the Raiders. The Raiders didn't have approval. They just moved.
That was when they moved to LA, right?
They moved to LA. Basically, Bidwell had said that, hard time for me. You can't fight City Hall. Franchise cannot be competitive while playing in Busch Stadium, the second smallest in the NFL, et cetera, et cetera. The other piece of that I glossed over in there, and this will bring us a little more up to present day, was they said the promise of building a new stadium. This was in 1988. Now, what happened was the savings and loan crash or some sort of early 90s financial downturn, basically doomed any prospect of that happening. So for 15 years, the Cardinals played more than 15 years. They played at Sun Devil Stadium, where the Arizona State team, so they were a tenant to a college team, which in the 70s was fine. The Dolphins were winning Super Bowls playing at the Orange Bowl, which was really the Miami Hurricane Stadium. You hear about teams playing at the LA Coliseum.
The Rams, the Rams played at the Coliseum forever.
Temporary, but the Rams played at the Coliseum. The Raiders were playing at the Coliseum at this point, but were causing a stink about it and ended up moving back to Oakland. Then the Cowboys play at Rice for a while, or the Cotton Bowl before Texas Stadium. So anyway, it happened, not in the mid 90s. And I remember watching Cardinals games because they were in the NFC East and it was empty. Nobody cared. So finally in February of 01, the new stadium for this article from the Phoenix newspaper at the time, the new stadium for the Arizona Cardinals will be built in Tempe. This was an announcement in early 2001, just a mile from where the team now plays. I guess there'd been an argument between whether they would play downtown or out in Tempe, where they ended up building the stadium. So they end up with in Tempe. It's there's an interesting article here, or it's just funny to see this quote where it says the people of Maricopa County should be listened to. It's just weird to hear the words Maricopa County in any other context but modern day elections.
That's true.
Because it's just somebody talking about saying the words Maricopa County that's not followed with like the late returns from Maricopa County. So anyway, they get the agreement in 2001. So after they'd already been there for 13 years to get the stadium built, and you have to believe if they'd been better in that time frame, that would have gone faster. You know what I mean?
Well, you raise an interesting point too. First of all, you talked about the NFC East. It's amazing that they were allowed to stay in the NFC East for as long as they were. I guess they really didn't do sort of, like division realignment in those days, but still you'd have three teams that literally could not be confused for anything but East Coast teams in Philly, the Giants, and Washington. And then Dallas, who was always going to be in the NFC East and had such a strong rivalry with all three of those teams. And then just to have the Cardinals in that division was always just really, really weird that they were there. And they stunk, so it was almost like they weren't there.
I cannot stress enough, and this goes back to when they were in St. Louis, but like you think about the 80s and the 90s in the NFC East and all those stories, and it rotated. It was in the early 80s and the late 70s, it was the Cowboys and it was Washington and Philly, and then the Giants got good and it was Philly and Washington, and then it was Philly and the Giants or Philly and the Eagles, and they all kind of rotated. There was a fifth team in that division the whole time that you basically just played twice, and it was taken for granted you would beat them twice. Like, I have DVDs of Giant seasons where they're just like, they go game by game, and it's like, and then after beating Arizona, they would turn their attention. Like, they don't even show the highlights of those games because it was just, they were the shorthand for a bad franchise in the NFL when I was a kid was the Cardinals. That's who you said when you were looking for a bad team to mention.
They had 1 year where they made the playoffs. So was it 98? I think it was.
Yeah, and they actually beat the Cowboys in the first round. They finished as a wild card. They beat the Cowboys in the first round and then got their butts kicked in the second round by, I don't know if it was San Francisco or Green Bay, but it was, or it might have been Minnesota actually if it was 98. But that was like their one playoff run between 1982 and 2008 was that.
Yeah, and this was the year that the NFC East was kind of bunched up because Dallas was 10-6, the Cardinals were 9-7, and the Giants were 8-8. So, and that was their one shot at it. So in 2007, sort of bringing us back to the present day from an organizational standpoint, this was their second year in what at the time was known as University of Phoenix Stadium, is now known as State Farm Stadium. This is the building that sort of was a state-of-the-art stadium, which you would expect when it's built. Had the slide-out field. It's a retractable roof stadium. It's actually in 2007. It was where the Super Bowl was played between the Giants and the Patriots at the end of the season. It's still a gold standard stadium and some of this has to do with the climate in Arizona, but not only do they get Super Bowls, I have it written right here. It's an arena that gets stuff. And what I mean by that is sort of the Final Four, the college football national championship or BCS game, whatever era we're talking about, the huge college football championships at the end of the year. They get WrestleManias, which, if you're not a wrestling fan, you might think that doesn't belong in this category, but in the terms of it's a thing that is vied for by multiple cities and fills the arena up with 80 to 90,000 people, it is a get. And Arizona, for all of those things, Super Bowls, Final Fours, college football playoff games, and WrestleMania, they are in the rotation every couple of years. They get one of those things. So this was not coincidentally when they moved into this building, they started becoming a more respectable franchise. And I would be willing to bet, and I will look this up now. My guess is they're probably one of the places that's getting a World Cup game in 4 years.
The only thing, and I'll check that. Yeah, because it's grass. Yeah. So what was revolution, and we will get to the 2007 team and players in a minute, but it was sort of a thing of, okay, that was the other thing I remember watching games at Sun Devil Stadium on TV. I've never been there, but the field always looked like crap because they were sharing it with a college team. It was a grass field. What they did here is, okay, we're going to play on grass. and we're going to play in a retractable roof stadium. But what we're going to do is on a tray, they basically slide the field out. Super Bowl 42 DVD I have on the Giants refers to it as a magic carpet, but it basically just slides out like you'd slide a tray out of your oven. And the field sits outside for 6 days, and then they wheel it back in for the game on Sunday. And you might see more. It's kind of a topic that's germane to what we're talking or to this day, literally this moment, as the players union in the NFL in the year 2022 is pushing for a lot of these stadiums to move to grass fields. You might see more of that kind of a system.
And I was wrong. They're not getting a World Cup game. The other thing that's interesting about
that might have to do with heat and
that's a good
stuff.
point.
Even if they can play that in a dome, it's still Arizona in July. They might not be, you know what I mean?
And I'm looking here. The stadium was known as University of Phoenix Stadium.
Mm-hmm.
But it wasn't because the University of Phoenix played there or owned it.
Do you know what the University of Phoenix is?
It's one of those for-profit schools, right?
Online schools, yeah, for-profit online schools.
So I don't know if I don't know if that ever even occurred to me that like that wasn't where the University of Phoenix, who probably doesn't even have a football team. If they're an online school, they probably don't have a football team. But that's just so weird. That never even occurred to me, and I probably heard that name dozens of times. That wasn't actually because a college played there. That was a naming rights, the same as Minute Maid or some crypto company that's out of business now. So I never knew that. It's interesting.
Yeah, and it was and for their credit, it stayed that for a long time, and then. Now it's State Farm, but it's not like one of those stadiums that's changed 100 times in its first 5 years of existence. But I think that can't be overstated. That's a big factor in the Cardinals, and they don't own that stadium, but that's they're the main tenants of that stadium, and people associate that stadium with the Cardinals compared to before when they played at a college football stadium and not all that well, and usually in front of tons of empty seats.
Before we go on, I should just give a plug. You talked about the Chicago Cardinals a little bit. Joe Ziemba, who is a podcast colleague of ours on the Sports History Network, he hosts the When Football Was Football podcast, and it is almost entirely about the days of the Chicago Cardinals. And he's written a couple of books on the Chicago Cardinals, including one that was just published about a month ago. I think it's called Football's Oldest Rivalry, and it's about the rivalry between the Bears and the Cardinals in Chicago, but then also after that. And he's going to be coming on the In Memoriam episode to talk to us about Charlie Trippi, who was a star running back and quarterback for the Chicago Cardinals in 1947 when they won their last ever championship, and just died this year at like 100 or 101 years of age. So Joe's going to be coming on to talk to us about Charlie Trippi throughout the course of the In Memoriam episode. So if you haven't gotten enough Cardinals history, you'll get a little bit there. But I guess maybe we should talk a little bit about this season, kind of such as it was.
Yep. And I want to talk about going into this, some of the personnel. There's late in his career, Edgerrin James. You got Anquan Bolden early in his career, Larry Fitzgerald a few years into his career, who's on his way to a Hall of Fame career and an All Pro, and on defense, a famous name you'd recognize is Antrell Roll. Also, Darnell Dockett is on the team. But where we should start is the quarterback thing, and I think what we should start with, although it takes place a couple years earlier, is the situation that surrounded Kurt Warner becoming a Cardinal. And it really is remarkable to talk about basically Kurt Warner's entire career between 2002 and 2007. And then the fact that he had some of the best years of his career after that is pretty remarkable, given where he was at this point in his career trajectory. So Kurt Warner had been, like we all know, had been sort of come out of nowhere, won a Super Bowl with the Rams in 1999 after taking over in, I think, week 2 after Trent Green got hurt, wins the MVP. They win the Super Bowl. He's sort of the story that's on everybody's mind for a year, the whole greatest show on turf. In 2001, the Rams are back in the Super Bowl. big upset by the Patriots, Tom Brady, Bill Belichick, right after 9/11, etc.
And Warner wins MVP in both of those years, 99 and 2001. Both of their Super Bowl years, he's MVP of the NFL.
The next year, he gets hurt quite a bit. There's a quarterback controversy in the ensuing year or so with Mark Bulger in St. Louis. Mike Martz is now the coach and actually has been since 2001. But Warner and him have a falling out. Warner is essentially told that his time with the Rams is coming to a close. Signs for a year with the Giants in 2004. This is Tom Coughlin's first year with the Giants. They had drafted Eli Manning first overall. Warner starts the first 9 games of the season. I will not dwell on this, but he's benched after 9 games. They're 5-4. Eli Manning comes in. They lose 6 of their last 7. This is not about the 04 Giants. It's about the 07 Cardinals. The only thing I will say is that Kurt Warner had 4 or 5 really good games and was clearly running out of gas by the time he was benched. Anyone who was actually watching the 04 Giants knew that it was time for him to be benched and that he should have been benched earlier. Lots of fumbles, lots of interceptions. He still had a big arm. He was still capable of making some plays. He was clearly a quarterback. And I say this, knowing that it was wrong. He was a quarterback in the twilight of his career. He's able to void the second year of his contract, leaves the Giants. I have the article from when he signed in March of 05. Kurt Warner wanted long-term security. He actually doesn't get what he's looking for. He wanted a long-term deal. The only thing that was really out there for him was a 1-year deal with the Cardinals. Cardinals got the free agent quarterback for $4 million. And the article here says, and because of the length of the contract, the team has also the flexibility to stick with incumbent starter Josh McCown if Kurt Warner doesn't work out. So this was not a guy that was brought in with a lot of fanfare. A 1-year contract. They're not sure they're going to start him over Josh McCown, but he signs in 05, ends up playing quite a bit in 05. Let me pull up the exact numbers. Yeah, in 2005, he plays in 10 games as the starter. He's 34 years old at this point. They only go 2-8 in the games he starts. Going into 06, the Cardinals draft Matt Leinart. Matt Leinart plays a lot in 06. Warner gets hurt. They go to Leinart. Leinart gets hurt. They go to Warner. So it's sort of a back and forth situation.
You're talking about in 05.
In 06 now, I'm sorry.
Okay, so 06 is interesting.
I might have misstated that. I'm trying to follow it, and it was confusing.
So I found a couple news articles on this. So Whisenunt comes in, and Leinart is the starter. But
this is going into 07 now, the year we're supposed to be focusing on.
Oh, you're right. I'm sorry. You're right. I mixed it up by a year. Okay, so I think what you described in 06 was accurate, and then 07 is interesting. So keep going.
And that's the year we're supposed to talk about. So basically, this is all just by way of setting the table of, they have Kurt Warner. And with hindsight, Kurt Warner still had a lot of really good years in them. Going into 2007, the last year Kurt Warner had that could be considered good was 2002. So it's been a long time. He's been in quarterback battles with a rookie Eli Manning, Josh McCown, Matt Leinart, who was drafted very high, but we know by the fact that his NFL career never really panned out that he was not destined to be a star. And this team is every indication of the old, if you have 2 quarterbacks, you have no quarterbacks thing. For all appearances, that's what this team looked like at this point going into 07.
Yeah, but they start the year with Leinart as the starter, but Whisenunt is not convinced of that. And 2 things that I noticed in both week 3 and 4, he pulls Leinart for Kurt Warner, in the middle of the game. He also had designed in the playbook, there was a specific package of plays that was only for Kurt Warner. So they were not just preparing him to be the backup. They were preparing him to be sort of this kind of separate part of the offensive game plan that they could go to whenever, I guess, Leinart was struggling. So there's a lot of bad feelings stemming from what you talked about the year before, or the couple of years before, but then also really extending into 07, even with the new coach, because he's not really committing to a quarterback. And then, of course, in week 5, Leinart fractures his collarbone. He's out for the year. And then all of a sudden it's Kurt Warner's team.
Yeah. And that's a sign of a dysfunctional franchise. And it's one we've seen a lot with the Giants recently. And I guess with the Jets too. And even you living down where you live with Washington, they had just drafted Matt Leinart the year before under a different regime. Now you have a new coach with a second-year quarterback who might not have any interest in that quarterback. So that's where you see pretty quickly he's going to the veteran, or he's at least showing some, showing some preferences to trying to work the veteran into the game. And then I guess his decision in a lot of ways was made easier for him when Matt Leinart broke his collarbone and is out for the rest of the season.
And here's the other thing I would say. This is a team that they play a lot of close games. They lose in week 1 by 3, win by 3, lose by 3, win by 7, win by 3, lose by 15, lose by 2. Then they lose by 7, win by 10, win by 8, lose in overtime by 6, win by 6. Then they get a blowout loss by 21 to Seattle, lose by 7, win in overtime by 3. And then their last game against Kurt Warner's former Ram team is a 29-point victory blowout. But by then the season's basically over. So this is a team that could have been, 5-11 and probably could have also been 11-5 if a couple things went in different directions throughout the course of this year. And that's borne out by the fact that the following year they're good and they're in the Super Bowl.
Yeah, so I think while you were counting that, I added up, and I think they only. Let's see. I'm just counting how many games were decided by more than one possession. Their first 5 games were all one possession games. Then they lost by 15, like you mentioned, is 1. Win by 10 is 2. Win by 8 will count as one possession because it is 3. They only had 4 games decided by more than one possession, and they were 2-2 in those games. So it's not like, it's not like, they got blown out 4 times and they won a bunch of close games. They're in the NFC West in 2007, which is not a bad division to be in from a difficulty standpoint. Seattle ends up winning the division, getting the 4 seed, the 3 seed, excuse me. And winning
Seattle, who had been to the Super Bowl 2 years ago, not the year before, 2 years ago in 2005.
2 years before that, but this was a noticeably weaker team. It wasn't quite the team it had been in 2005. I think they had a really bad year in 2006, if I'm remembering correctly. Not that super matters, but they may have lost in the second round to the Bears. Never mind, I'm an idiot. But not a super tough division. They also play the AFC North, which has a bad Bengals team, an actually okay Browns team, a Baltimore team that doesn't have much offense at the time, and then Pittsburgh, who wins the division but doesn't really shock anybody. Although, interestingly enough, when they would play Pittsburgh in week 4 and beat them 21-14, who would have known that the next time those two teams locked up would have been the next year's Super Bowl?
Yep.
Believe it or not.
Yep. That's a really good point.
And then they played also the NFC South. Or no, the NFC South. So like the Falcons and the Bucks and the Panthers. So not a ton of real dominant teams like we talked about. And they at no point were, I guess the furthest under 500 they got was 3-5. They were never over 500 at any point. They were 0-1, 1-1, 1-2, 3-2. Now, because they were over 500 at 3-2, but they lost 3 games in a row at one point. The most they ever won in a row was 2 at one point, or at a couple of points, but no sort of singular moments to talk about, even in terms of like, well, they weren't very good, but it was a really exciting game or anything like that. At least none that I can remember.
Nothing that stood sort of the test of time in history. With all those close games, you're sure that some of them were memorable. But like you said, they didn't play any teams that ended up doing anything that meant anything the rest of the season either. So it was a close game, but it was a close game in week 10 between two teams that weren't going anywhere. So what difference did it make, right?
Yeah. And I mean, it was 15 years ago, so it's hard. But there was no like looking up the art. There was no like, oh, remember this sort of forgotten classic game? Nothing that I could see there. I mean, they played a few overtime games.
One thing I will notice that they got three Hall of Famers or two Hall of Famers now, and one presumptuous Hall of Famer or presumptive Hall of Famer at all at the skill positions. Warner's in the Hall of Fame. Edgerrin James, and this is sort of Edgerrin James's last good year. 324 rushes for 1,222 yards and 7 touchdowns. His last 1,000 rushing yards season, really his last full season. The following year in the Super Bowl year, he only plays in 13 games, only starts 7 of them. I don't even know if James actually plays in the Super Bowl. I remember hearing him kind of complain as they were going on that Super Bowl run in 2008 that he wasn't getting the attention that he wanted in the offense. But his last great year, one of Fitzgerald's, Larry Fitzgerald, who's going to the Hall of Fame one day, he's 24 years of age, 100 catches, 1,409 yards. This is his fourth year in the league. The second time he's topped 100 catches. This is interesting. In 2005, he had 103 catches. In 2007, he had exactly 100 catches. In both of those seasons, he had exactly 1,409 receiving yards. So he ties his then career high from 2 years ago exactly down to the yard. Fitzgerald had actually had a really good relationship with Dennis Green and was not happy to see Green go, but continues to perform increasingly well. And there are some people I feel like who talk about that Anquan Boldin is a potential Hall of Famer also. So there's yet another one. Three-time Pro Bowler. Boldin ends up with 7,000 yard receiving seasons from Boldin. So yeah, potentially a dark horse Hall of Fame candidate in Anquan Boldin. So the offense has got a lot of firepower and a lot of guys who either had done great things or would go on to do great things for a team that only goes 8-8.
Yeah, and Boldin missed a lot of this year. This is actually one of the lower years of his statistically, if you look. But 05, he had 1,400 yards on 102 catches. 03, which I believe was his rookie year, he had 1,377 yards on 101 catches. 06, just the year before this, 1,200 yards. The next year in 08, he's over 1,000. This year in 07 is his worst year in Arizona, or second to worst year in Arizona. He only plays in 12 games. He gets 71 catches for 800 and change, which is still a really good year, but down a little bit. Fitzgerald was the third pick in the draft in 2004. He was, and it's funny because so much of 2004 gets written about in the context of the quarterbacks. You had the thing where Eli Manning gets drafted 1 by the Chargers, and had already said he wanted a trade. And then 4, the Giants take Phillip Rivers and they work a trade out, and Ben Roethlisberger gets picked a little while later. In the middle of all of that, the Cardinals picked Larry Fitzgerald, number 3rd overall, and he goes on to be one of the greatest receivers of all time, and is also, as good as he was, is still a what-if story due to the quarterback play that he had for most of his career. Right after this, he gets a few real years with Kurt Warner. 08, 09, maybe Warner plays in 10, I can't remember. But after that, it's back to the revolving door. Carson Palmer had a couple good years when he could stay on the field, but man, did Larry Fitzgerald have some poor quarterback play in his career.
Warner's last year is 2009 when he is 38 years of age. So by that point, you're right. And then it's nothing much and he never leaves. He's like Joe Thomas. He never leaves Arizona. And I think he was sort of like, embedded in the community there and just never really wanted to leave. It was always kind of my understanding.
Yep. And if you want to look at consistency, in 05, he had 103 catches for 1,409 yards. In 07, he had 100 catches for 1,409 yards.
Is that stat just as impressive as when I said it 2 minutes ago?
They had the exact same number 2 years in a row?
2 years out of 3.
2 years out of 3. I'm sorry. I'll edit that out to make my look stupid. I was probably looking at Bolden's numbers. And then in 08 was his best year, 1,431. So, he's right pocket of his career. But if you look at some of these other years, 2015, 1,215 yards. I have no idea who the Cardinals quarterback was in 2015. I'm going to look it up right now.
It was Carson Palmer.
Okay, that was one of Palmer's good years, I think. And that might have actually been the year they got to the NFC championship game and lost to the Seahawks, I believe it was. But Fitzgerald, as good as he is, and it's how acknowledged is that, like how good he is acknowledged, but he's still underrated.
You were close in 15. They didn't lose to the Seahawks. They lost to Carolina 49-15 in a blowout. But yeah, here's some of the quarterbacks. After Warner retires, you got a year of Derek Anderson, then a couple of years of Kevin Kolb, then Palmer most years, although there's 1 year of Drew Stanton as the leading passer thrown in there, and then more Palmer, and then they got 1 year of Josh Rosen, and then he managed to pay. He got the last couple of years of his career with Kyler Murray, so he went out on a decent note. But even so, yeah, no, he probably would have done more if he had somebody to throw to him. But again, he's one of those guys who I'm sure at some point could have left, but chose not to for whatever reason.
And then the other thing, you mentioned Edgerrin James at the beginning. Edgerrin James was the leading rusher on the Cardinals in 2007, 324 carries for 1,222 yards. Second was J.J. Arrington. Would you like to guess how many yards J.J. Arrington ran for? Remember, James ran for 1,222.
306?
306? 78.
I was going to
78 yards.
I was going to guess a single digit number or a double digit number, but I thought that would just make me look foolish. So yeah, well, with Kurt Warner throwing the ball to Larry Fitzgerald and sometimes Anquan Boldin, you can understand why they didn't run the ball too much other than Edgerrin James.
But even still, that's a number from like the 60s where you have like one workhorse back. You know what I mean?
That's like a number from the 80s.
Edgerrin James was 29 this year in 2007. And I believe he's one of the prime examples people use when they talk about running backs being shot after 30. Because look at the year he had it when he was 29, and then he's gone in 2 years. He's out of the league in a couple of years after that.
Yeah, he's injured. He's basically injured and or ineffective from there on out.
On the defense, there's a couple of names that definitely are deserving to be talked about. Calvin Pace is on this team, who went on after this was his last year with Arizona, and then went on and was sort of a staple for those Jets teams, first Rex Ryan, and then a little bit after that. Carlos Dansby, who also enjoyed a long career, was just sort of in the beginning phases of his career with Arizona, went on, has had a stretch with Miami, Cleveland, was actually back on Arizona twice. He was one of those guys. You also had, I mentioned at the beginning of the show, I mentioned Antrel Roll, who went on to be a giant, a staple of the Giants Super Bowl team in 2011. Roderick Hood, Darnell Dockett, who along with Fitzgerald was the only other Pro Bowler on the team. So there's some good defensive talent on this team. A lot of names. They finished from a ranking standpoint. I'm trying to figure this out. They were 27th in points against, which is kind of surprising when you consider some of those names on defense, and actually 7th in scoring offense. So the offense was a much better unit, as I guess you could imagine with the talent. But usually you would think an 8-8 team, you think, okay, they're middle of the pack in both. Instead, it was a very good offensive unit and a very bad statistically defensive unit.
You mentioned Darnell Dockett. He's the only other Pro Bowler along with Fitzgerald. 9 sacks in 16 starts. I think it's his only ever Pro Bowl appearance. Dockett, he's a defensive lineman. The other guy who was I noticed was a guy by the name of Adrian Wilson, who was a safety for the Cardinals, who had been kind of a mainstay of the past several years, and he goes down with an injury during the season, and that brings to an end his streak of 59 starts in a row. So he had sort of been a point of consistency for the Cardinals over those last few years, and this is their first non-losing season since 2007. I'm sorry, since 1998, when we talked about when they had made the playoffs, when they were still in the NFC East. I think the other thing that's interesting is that they then go into the 2008 season, and even though they make the Super Bowl, they only do it at 9-7. So it's not as if they are sort of drastically improved from the team a year ago. They just get hot at the right time in 08. They win the wild card playoff against Falcons by 6 points, blowout against the Panthers, but then the NFC title game, they only win by a touchdown against Philly. So it's not as if, okay, well, they were mediocre in 07 and then in 08 they just exploded and they were, 12-4 or something like that. They were still a middle of the road team who just happened to get hot at the right time in 08.
And I remember that 08 team was they were the 3 seed, I believe. Like you said, they won that game against Atlanta. I remember I think that was the Saturday game. And that was Matt Ryan's first year. And then the second round, the top 2 seeds in the NFC that year were the Giants and the Panthers. And they both got beat. The Cardinals beat the crap out of the Panthers on a Saturday night. Jake Delhomme threw like 3 or 4 interceptions. He was horrible. And then the next day, the Giants lost to the Eagles. So I believe this was the first, or no, it had happened in 06. But the Cardinals were home in the first round. We're on the road in the second round. And then we're back home in the NFC Championship game in 08. And they had a big lead. The Eagles came back. They held them off. And then they played one of the classic Super Bowls of all time and lost to the Steelers. And it was funny, that 08 calendar year, there were 2 sort of perennial loser franchises that had these miraculous runs to the championship round and then came up just short in the championship round because just a few months before this, the Tampa Bay Rays had on a miraculous run. Theirs was a little less gradual than the Cardinals was, and got to the World Series and lost to the Phillies. So 2 sort of out of nowhere teams in 2008.
And I don't want to slight Darnell Dockett. He was actually a 3-time Pro Bowler, 07, 09, and 2010 at defensive end for the Arizona Cardinals. So props to him for 3 Pro Bowl appearances in his career. I don't know what else there is to say. I think it's interesting to talk about a team that was kind of mediocre, stayed mediocre, but then a year later went on this crazy Super Bowl run. They've got some Hall of Famers. I am skeptical, frankly, of the Hall of Fame credentials of Kurt Warner, but that might be a conversation for a different time. What else we got on these guys before we wrap it up?
So I did just want to point out, and like you said, yeah, this is kind of and nobody's making us do this, but this is sort of the perfect storm of like, it's a team that was recently enough that we can't talk a ton about how different the league was. They weren't so horrendously bad that there's a lot of hilarious stories. They weren't even good enough, or like, and they played New England and this happened. There's just not a lot with the games themselves. And the thing to underscore that. And so it's funny because when you think about teams in the internet era, there's a lot more out there on, random 5-11 teams than there is about, teams that were amazing in the 50s and 60s, because just so much more survives now. So like if you go to like, probably even the 70, maybe not the 72 Dolphins, but like a team like that, in the game summary Wikipedia, it'll have like a box score and like a scoring summary. But then if you look at any team from the last 5 years, you'll have like a full recap of the game and everything. The Wikipedia for all has, lists all the games and notes and everything for these Cardinal games that year, but they get shorter and shorter. And when you get to week 16, which was an overtime loss to the Falcons, it's got the score by quarter, it's got the date, the location, the game start, the announcers, and then for like the paragraph, like the narrative summary, it says, with the win, the Cardinals improved to 7-8. And that's entire narrative discussion of the game was just after the game, this was their record, and then we're moving on. That was another thing. The next week they beat up on the Rams, and it says, with the win, the Cardinals improved to 8-8. 29-point victory allowed them to finish the season with a positive point differential for the first time since 1993. So that was the first year they'd had more points for than points against since 1993. And the only other thing I wanted to point out about that 08 team, which I was thinking about the other day, and I didn't put this together till later that year. That was when I was living in DC, or you and I were sharing a house in Alexandria. And I did one. I had done games broadcasting on the radio in college, which was just a year before that at this point. And somehow through a connection at work, a coworker of mine said, "Oh, my friend does the Catholic University football games, and he needs somebody this week to do it." So I was doing the game. It was Catholic against somebody. I don't even remember. It was a Saturday afternoon. We were doing the game on the radio, and you could see off in the distance, all of a sudden, there were guys in. It was the Arizona Cardinals were there to practice. And the reason was they had played, I forget whether it was the week before or whatever, but long story short, they played the Redskins one of those weeks. Let me pull this up because I can figure it out. They played the Redskins one of those weeks, and then they had another East Coast game either the week before or the week after. So rather than flying back home, they decided to stay in on the East Coast and practice in DC. It was definitely in October. Yeah. So week 3, they played the Redskins in Maryland. And then in week 4, they played the Jets at
MetLife.
They played the Jets at a Giant Stadium. But
yeah, that's right. It was in Giant Stadium then.
I believe that must have been the day before the Redskin game, because they wouldn't have still the day before another game, they wouldn't have still been. But I remember watching that and being like, oh, wow, that's the Arizona Cardinals over there. And then later that year, they went to the Super Bowl. So just a funny little aside. But yeah, it's not a team that's tremendously remarkable, but that's kind of the point of this is to talk about wherever the wheel turns. And this was a tough one, but there's always little nuggets you can find in there.
Absolutely. All right, and you get a shorter episode because we couldn't do more than an hour on this. All right, well, until next time, thank you for joining us. And until next time, I'm Dan Newman.
And I'm Andrew Newman. Goodbye, old sports.
Hey there, sports history fan. This is Arnie Chapman, a.k.a. the Football History Dude. And I hope that you enjoyed this recent episode presented by the Sports History Network and were able to learn some good old-fashioned sports history knowledge nuggets. I started the Sports History Network back in 2020 with the mission to help podcasters find a community of like-minded sports history nerds, as well as helping aspiring podcasters to start their own shows. We have a little bit over 30 shows on the network right now covering all sorts of sports history, but as far as I'm concerned, we're just at the toothpick in the ocean moment, that can't even figure it out because there's so much more coming. We wanted to create the ultimate headquarters for sports yesteryear, starting with Podcast Network and our website, but we're going to continue to move into other mediums as well. And here's the cool part, because we want you to be part of our team. So if you're interested in starting your own podcast, or maybe being a guest on one of our shows, or who knows, maybe even writing an article for us over on the website. Seriously, all you got to do is reach out to us on the contact page over at sportshistorynetwork.com. You can be as technologically savvy as a Neanderthal tapping on a stone trying to figure out this whole hieroglyphics thing back in the day. Again, it doesn't matter, because even if you don't understand the whole podcast space, we have a production team that can pretty much help you out with doing everything. All you got to do, head over to sportshistorynetwork.com, head to the contact page, fill it out. That message goes right to me, and I'll reach out to you as soon as I can. But for now, dude, I'm through if you're through.